Alright, so in this video I'm going to give an overview of my Lightning Tailwind Micro recumbent bike. So I've had this bike for about 6 months now, and I got it back in December because I was having some issues with my hands and my wrists when I was riding a conventional bike. I was getting some pain there, and I wanted to try riding a recumbent bike to see if that could solve the problem. So this bike is what you call a long wheelbase recumbent, which means that the back wheel, of course, is behind where you sit, and the front wheel is in front of where your cranks would go. They do make some bikes which are called short wheelbase, where this wheel, instead of being up here, would actually be somewhere back here, so it's behind where your cranks are. The most common question that I get when I'm riding this around town is, how do you steer that thing? Well, this bike is also what you call an underseat steering bike, which means that the place where you steer is down here, and you'll see that, so that's below where you sit, so that's called underseat steering. And the way that it works is it has a pivot point, which is right there, that this thing pivots off of. Of course, it's got all the same controls that a regular bike would, your brakes and your shift levers, and on this side I even have my bell and my mirror. But of course, the actual wheel is way up front, so there's this bar which is right here, your steering linkage, which runs up along beside the frame. And when I turn the handlebars back here, you can see that that linkage pulls and pushes the wheel so it moves. Underseat steering is quite uncommon for new bikes that are for sale today, but back in the 90s when this bike was made, underseat steering was just as common for recumbent bikes as overseat steering. This particular model of recumbent bike is called a Tailwind Micro, and it's made by a company called Lightning Cycle Incorporated Recumbent Bikes, and they were located and they built this bike in Swanson, Ohio. Now, as confusing as it may be, back in the era when this bike was made, there were actually two companies in the United States that made recumbent bikes that were called Lightning, and they were completely unaffiliated with one another. I believe that they probably didn't, when they first started, know that each other existed, and they were operating on completely different sides of the country. So as far as I know, the Swanson, Ohio Lightning Cycle Incorporated company only ever manufactured two different models of bikes. As I said, this one is called the Tailwind Micro, and they also sold one which is just called the Tailwind. And the only thing that really made them different is that this bike here has 20-inch front wheel and also a 20-inch back wheel, where their non-micro Tailwind version would have had a full-size road bike back wheel, 27-inch or 700C back wheel, and the front wheel would have been the same. So this is actually, I believe, meant for shorter people, because it's made to be lighter and smaller, and unfortunately the bike is actually a little bit too small for me. So the only other identifying marks other than this here is, it says on here, which I think was just written in marker or possibly hand painted, it says Pennies, and then on this side it says Earth Cruiser. So I imagine that one of the earliest owners of this bike was named Penny, and this was her Earth Cruiser. So another thing which sets this bike apart from other bikes of the era is that, of course, I showed you that it uses a steering linkage, which is quite common for underseat steering bikes. But what makes this one unique is that, of course, it's got your front brake up here, and the brake cable actually runs through a hole in that linkage there, which runs all the way back to where your handlebars come out and where your brake lever is. It was actually quite an ingenious idea because, of course, as you move your handlebars, that part there, you know, moves with it, and up at the front here, when I turn the wheel, that part moves with it. Where on most bikes, otherwise you probably have your cable just kind of wrapping around here, and maybe it'd be attached to the frame here somewhere. But as you turn, this cable would probably run up against the frame, and probably most of us have seen bikes where a cable's been rubbing here, and you can see that it's worn away some of the paint. Another benefit, of course, is that because your brakes are up here and this cable has to go past where your cranks are, it's just one less thing that can get hung up in your cranks when you're pedaling. So each side of the handlebars are attached independently to this middle piece here, and if you undo this little quick release here, you're able to loosen it off, and then you can change the angle of these handlebars to get them to a position which is comfortable for while you're riding. When you're riding the bike and you want to have a drink of water, there's not really a very good place to mount it up here because while you're riding, you know, your knees are coming up along here. So instead they put the water bottle holders back here behind where your seat is, which is actually not too difficult to reach. I have one water bottle holder there, and you can also mount another one here on the other side, although I don't have one mounted there yet. This little piece here is also for having a flag, so that you're able to be seen by vehicles when you're sharing the road with cars. So you can just insert a flag in there and it sticks up and it makes you much more visible. So I'll also show you how the seat adjustment works. So the seat's made out of this sort of mesh material, which is mounted on a steel frame, and then the bottom of this steel frame has these little round pieces which go over the main tube there. Of course, they have this plastic on there to protect the tubing, but that thing is able to slide to different positions on there, and the thing which holds it in place is back here. There's another parallel piece which is back there. It runs parallel with that bottom thing there, and it actually looks very similar to a regular seat post on a regular bike. It's got a quick release there. Alright, so now to demonstrate that, I'll just undo this quick release here, which I actually had on there pretty loose just for this demonstration, and then I'll just unscrew this from the other side a little bit more. This bolt is really nice and loose in there. And then if I come in here and I grab my seat, I'm able to give it a little bit of a tug, like that, and now I'm able to move it to another position, and then of course I could come back in here and lock it in that position instead. Now if you needed to make your bike smaller for transporting it somewhere, you could actually pull this seat all the way out and push it past the end, and then the seat actually comes all the way off. So now that I have the seat off the bike, this is a probably good opportunity to show you some of the accessories and modifications that I've made to the bike since I got it. So one of the first things I did to the bike after I got it was I put a bell and a mirror on the bike, which are, you know, pretty standard. Particularly for a recumbent bike though, with having the seat back behind you, it actually makes it quite hard to be able to look directly behind you. You're not really able to turn as far because the seat back kind of gets in the way. So having a mirror is quite essential. One of the next things I did though, after I took it for the first few test rides, riding on the roads back in, you know, early January, late December, there's quite a bit of slush and water and a little bit of salt on the roads when I was riding around. And I was finding that with the geometry of this bike, when there was water on the wheel, that water was shooting up and coming up and hitting me pretty much right in the face and all over the front of my jacket or my shirt. So anywhere I would ride, I would have like this really dirty looking jacket, you know, even if I just cleaned it before getting on my bike. So that was definitely not fun. So one of the very first things I did after that was I put fenders on the bike. So I bought these ones. They were the, you know, really there's not a whole lot of selection of wheels, fenders for 20-inch wheels. So these are the ones that I could find, and I wouldn't particularly recommend them. They were kind of tricky to get on. They had, they didn't say anything about this in the instruction manual, but these pieces here, they were actually about this much longer. And you, as I said, didn't say anything about it in the instructions, but to make it fit, you had to actually cut those down. And you kind of only had one shot at it. These aren't really adjustable, so once you kind of set them in place, there's just a screw which holds it, and it's pretty much locked in that position. So, as I said, not the most convenient. And the other thing I don't like is that the back fender, you know, it's good, it starts down here and it comes up, but for some reason they just decided to stop the fender right there. And as you can see, you know, there's quite a bit of mud and water and stuff that builds up there. And if you look up here, the bottom of the rack is just covered in lots of muddy water. And when I have things, you know, in my milk crate back here, if I have my backpack or something like that, I take it out from a wet ride, and the bottom of it is just, you know, soaking wet. So I don't really understand why they wouldn't just make, you know, the fenders just go all the way down like a normal fender would. So the next accessory that I did was I put on the rack and the milk crate. So this is just a regular standard aluminum rack for a bike, although I had to modify it a bit to make it work. One of the things I did right here for having the fenders, I had to saw off that little, there'll be a little piece on here which would be the same as this one here. So to make it fit, I had to saw that off. And then at the front here, because the seat comes back to, you know, just about here, this part here, there would be another little part which came up, which is kind of the front of the rack so that your stuff wouldn't go forward. So the seat's in the way, so I had to saw those off as well. Of course, I rounded over the corners pretty well so that it wouldn't cut into the seat. So then the method that I used for holding the rack to the bike is I got this piece of metal here, and I put one across the top, and then I bent one which comes down and around the bottom. I have a piece of rubber in there to protect the frame, and then that just kind of clamps it in place so it's secured there from the front. So the milk crate's just held on there the way that I normally like to hold milk crates onto bikes. I'll just use some of this type of string, which I like. So I do have a flag which I use with this bike, but I still decided that I wanted to build something a little bit better than a flag. So I built this metal bar which comes up and around the top. And the idea with that is a little flag does help you make you more visible, you know, higher up in the air. It makes you taller. It doesn't really help you very much at night, where with this I've added a bike light on the top here, which I can turn on at night, so then I'm easily able to be seen when I'm riding at night. My original plan with this actually had been to put strips of LEDs all the way along this, and actually so the material I made this out of is electrical conduit, and the neat thing about that is that the diameter of this, or the inside diameter of this, is just a little bit bigger than a AA battery. So I was planning on keeping my batteries, having a battery pack which is built into the light bar here, and that would be how I would power the thing. In the end I decided not to do that. Well, I haven't done it yet. I might eventually do it, but the reason why I haven't done it yet is because I'm concerned that this is going to be exposed to weather and rain and things, and I don't really have a good way of being able to attach those LED strips on there in a way that will be, you know, really fully waterproof, so that they're not going to start peeling off over time. In the meantime, just using regular bike lights up here seems to be working just fine. One of my design requirements for this light bar here, though, was that it needed to be foldable, because from time to time I need to bring this bike in my elevator, or on the weekend I had it in the back of my parents' van. So, you know, having this thing stick up all the way up here, that makes it very difficult to be able to fit it anywhere. So it either needed to be very easy to disattach from here, or have a way of folding it. So I designed a way for me to fold it. I'm supporting it by these two plastic blocks here, and this part here is actually hinged. So I have it held in place by a bungee cord here. So if I undo this really tight bungee cord from here like that, and then I do the same over here on the other side, then I grab this from down here and push, I'm then able to fold this thing down, which makes it a lot easier to fit in places such as the elevator. So this is made from recycled HDPE plastic, and there's lots of videos on YouTube showing you how to do that, but basically I took some recycled plastic and I melted it down in my oven into a block, and then I machined it using my woodworking tools into the shapes that I needed it to be. So I have a bracket down there which looks like that, so basically when the bar comes down, the bungee cord holds it in that slot. So I have those on both sides, and then on the tops of these I have another block of plastic here which has a hole drilled in it and a slit here, and to get that in place I tighten up a bolt which runs through there, and that sandwiches that bracket around it there. And then I've got a regular 1-inch hinge which I just have screwed into the plastic there, and another piece which is screwed in over here, and that piece fits in to the side of the milk crate there, and then I have it held in place with some screws on the other side. Rather than buying or borrowing a conduit bender for making this bend into the piece of conduit that I used here, I just made my own bending guide out of some plywood. And one of the advantages of doing that was I was able to make the radius of curvature be exactly the radius that I needed, so that, you know, these bars would just come straight up and go straight into a curve. Otherwise, if I'd used a standard conduit bender, the bends probably would have been tighter than that, so it would have looked a little bit different. It would have come straight, had a sharp turn, and then a flat top, and then another sharp turn on the other side. So another thing that I needed to fix on this bike when I first got it was the gearing on the bike. I found that whenever I tried to climb a really steep hill, even if I went into the very lowest gear, that it really took an awful lot of force to be able to climb that hill. And my commute to work has some quite substantial hills, and I was really concerned that climbing those hills without being able to gear down very far would probably do some damage to my knees, which I didn't want to do. So I had to make some modifications to the gearing. So you'll notice that this bike has quite large front chain rings. This bigger one here is a 52 tooth, and the smaller one's only a 42 tooth. So I was thinking at first, okay, why don't I just swap this front crank for more of a mountain bike style one, which has much smaller chain rings, which would make it much better, you know, much easier for pedaling for going up a hill. The problem with that is that a standard mountain bike crank, the biggest chain ring's only a 38, so it's smaller than this one here. And because this bike has such a small back wheel, it's only a 20-inch back wheel, when you make a rotation of your back wheel, the bike doesn't go very far compared to if it was, you know, a full-size road bike back wheel. So if I had changed it to a mountain bike sprocket where my biggest chain ring is only a 38, the top speed of this bike would be significantly less. It would be a very, very slow bike. So ultimately, I've been hoping I'd be able to find a chain ring or a crank set which still had a 52 tooth biggest chain ring and had a smaller one than a 42, or maybe had 3, so that the 42 could be my middle one, and then I'd have, you know, maybe a 32 tooth smaller one, which would make it better for climbing hills. However, when I started looking into buying new cranks, I discovered that they're ridiculously expensive. You know, to buy a new set of cranks, which would have, you know, the type of chain rings or the size of chain rings that I wanted, would have been at least $200 or more. So I decided to do something else instead. So what I did instead was I switched my Freewheel for a different one. Now, as you can see, this one here, it has a very giant biggest sprocket. So this is my lowest gear right here, and as you can see, it's very, very large compared to even the next one on here. I believe they call these the mega range type of cassettes or freewheels. You know, I did all the math and everything, and I found that using this chain ring here was pretty much equivalent, you know, factoring in the size of the tire with, you know, using my lowest gear on one of my other bikes. So that seemed to solve the problem. The only other thing I had to do, though, is that the derailleur that came with it, of course, it wasn't designed for having such a large you know, chain ring on here, so I had to swap this one out. So I was able to upgrade and, you know, effectively make this bike be able to access a much lower ratio without even buying anything. I was able to use these 2 parts, which I already had in my inventory from discarded bikes that I have collected over the years. So I really love this bike, although I've discovered that it's unfortunately slightly too small for me. As you can see, I have the heel of my foot on my pedal, and I have the pedal at its full front position, and you can see that my knee has a slight bend into it, where normally when your heel is on the pedal, your leg should be completely straight. When I first got the bike, I didn't think that was going to be a really huge deal, although unfortunately I found that on longer rides, I was starting to get some pain in my knees. And I got the bike in the first place because I had pain in my hands, so I really didn't want to be trading in the pain in my hands for now having pain in my knees instead. So as soon as I realized that this bike was slightly too small for me, I decided to continue my search looking for other recumbent bikes that were for sale in the used market. But in the meantime, I was still hoping that I'd be able to use this bike for at least a temporary basis. So I wanted to see if there's some way that I could possibly, you know, make this seat go back a little bit further to give me a little bit of extra leg length that I needed. But of course, as you can see, I've already got the seat bottomed out back here, and with the way that the seat is designed, you know, there's really no way of making that go back any further. So I considered ideas of maybe, you know, somehow modifying the seat to, you know, change the shape of it so it could go back a little bit further. Another option which I looked into was getting longer cranks, because apparently they make cranks which are about 1 centimeter longer than the ones that's on this bike. And so that one little extra centimeter over there would let my legs extend a little bit further. However, I wasn't necessarily convinced that that was going to solve my problem though, because I was actually feeling like, you know, the pain that I was getting in my knees from riding a bike that was too small for me, I thought that might have actually been caused from the backstroke. So for example, when I have my foot around this position here, you can see that my knee is really compressed. So making a longer crank would have actually made my knee even more compressed. So it might have actually made the problem worse. In addition to that, as I mentioned before, if I were to replace my cranks, they would have been $200 or more even for the least expensive pair that I could buy. However, after thinking about it for a while, I had the idea of using an old couch cushion and setting that on top of here, which as you can see, raises me up by about 1 inch when that's compressed. And because the cranks are a fair bit lower than where the seat is, they give me a little bit of extra extension and make this bike fit me a little bit better. Eventually I realized that I needed a little bit more height than that, so I found this foam pad, which I put down on the seat. Then I put my couch cushion down, and now when I sit down and I put my heel on the crank over there, you can see that my leg is completely straight. So another modification that I had to do as a result of using these cushions here is because the cushions raised me up a little bit. So now when I'm leaning on the back of the seat, my back is hitting it at a much higher spot. So this part of the seat really isn't taking very much weight. Most of the weight was actually going into the back of the milk crate here, which proved to be fairly uncomfortable after doing it for a few days. So I went to the hardware store and I bought this piece of foam insulation. This is used for copper piping, and it wasn't expensive at all, and it fits on there perfectly. It actually has adhesive little strips on both sides, so I stuck it right on there, and it's been working really well. So using these cushions here certainly isn't a perfect solution. I find them a little bit annoying because they move around a little bit when I'm riding. Of course, there are things that I could do to fasten it in place, but this is only ever intended to be a temporary solution to enable me to ride this bike back and forth to work for a while, as I was looking for a new recumbent bike that was more suitable. So I'm happy to announce that in the time when I was riding this bike as my temporary measure, I was able to find a more suitable bike that was for sale, and this past Sunday I went and bought it. So one of my next videos, I'll be showing you my new recumbent bike. But other than the fact that this bike didn't fit me, I think it's a really great bike. I certainly think that Lightning Cycle in Swanton, Ohio made some really great bikes. And if you happen to see one that's for sale that fits you properly, I think it's probably a good buy, assuming it's been well maintained over the years. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.